Hello and welcome to this unit where we're going to talk about buying social and start to take your first steps in terms of engaging with social enterprises. This unit is going to be primarily aimed at buyers within big businesses. So when I talk about you, I'm going to be talking about those people in big businesses who are looking at how they might look to engage with social enterprises. But hopefully some of the things that I'm going to cover will also be of real use to social enterprise suppliers themselves who are looking at how they can engage in the big business supply chains. And through the course of this unit, I'm going to cover three main things. The first is going to be on how you, as a buyer in a big business, make the case within your organisation to taking this forward. The second is going to be on how to get started and what are the first things that you might want to do to engage with social enterprise. And the third thing is going to be our top tips from the last 6 years of running the Buy Social Corporate Challenge on how you can really drive this through your organisation. So starting at the strategic level, and this is if you were pitching to your CEO or to your board, then you would talk about the strategic drivers for why you do this. So one of those might be around thinking about the changing nature of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and how that's starting to be seen as something that is too reactive and too on the side of the way that the business operates, whereas the procurement function and what you buy as a business is absolutely directly aligned to what you do and the way that you operate. And so by doing something like this that is much more credible and much more directly engaged with how the business operates, you're bringing in other things such as the opportunity to bring in talent and bring in young people who have a different view on how these things should work, and also to present yourself differently to your customers and your clients, whether they're in the government sector or the private sector or within the general public, all of whom will see opportunities in this area. One of the reasons why this is such an interesting area is because of the scale of the opportunity. So when you look at a corporate social responsibility budget, for example, within the FTSE 100, that would average around £10 million a year of spend, whereas when we look at the procurement opportunity, spend runs into the billions amongst big companies. And so the ability for you to influence the impact that you have on the world is so much bigger through your supply chain than it is through your CSR activity. The next thing to think about would be if you were pitching to your CPO or within your procurement team to look at the opportunity around this. And here there's been some very interesting research done by Procurious, which is presented in the graph here, which looks at the changing nature of procurement focus and the areas that they're going to see as the major challenges and opportunities moving forward. And what you can see there is a real focus away from cost and risk, which have been the traditional hallmarks of the procurement function, and much more looking at things like innovation, sustainability, and some of those business drivers. And again, when you look at the opportunity around buying social and around working with social enterprises, they are both very strong on bringing innovation and new ideas and different approaches, but also obviously very strong around sustainability in terms of the way they operate, who they employ, and how they carry out their businesses. One of the other 2030 drivers has been around relationship building and how the procurement function can build better relationships with the suppliers it works with. And again, around this, there's a real opportunity to have a different conversation with your big suppliers, talking about how they can support you in your initiative to buy social, rather than just around how you can look at the most recent metrics around their performance and around costs. So driving a really different conversation that can have much broader benefits for you as a business. And the third is if you were pitching this to your CSR function, or if you were talking about this at home with your family about why were you looking to pursue this. And here I think the strength of the social enterprise supplier base and the story that that's got to tell is really powerful. Social enterprises are both growing very strongly economically. So if you look at the top few points here in terms of the rate at which they're expanding, the innovation that they're bringing, and these are all much, much higher than they are for mainstream businesses in the UK. The second side of that is to how they're performing socially. So again, much, much more diverse than their mainstream business counterparts, much more likely to be based in areas of high deprivation, and much more representative in terms of who runs them and who owns them. And from a business perspective, that means that they're bringing innovation in terms of new ideas and different thinking, as well as diversity. So really capitalizing on some of those business drivers from the previous examples I gave, as well as that real social feel of this is something different and something that I can bring to my job that feels different to the mainstream work that I do. When speaking to the head of a major procurement organization a couple of years ago, he told me that when he'd first started in his role, he'd been told by the then head of procurement that if you want to be popular in procurement, buy a dog. And I think this reflects the view at the time, and still in some businesses, that procurement is very much around risk, cost mitigation, management, and not about the wider strategy or opportunity within the organisation. And I think here in social enterprise, there's a real opportunity for procurement teams to both buy the goods and services they need, but also reflect the opportunity around their communities and the social need of what they can bring. And you don't even have to buy a dog to do it. So you've got buy-in now from your leadership to move forward with this agenda. And I think the first thing you need to think about then is where your business sits. And broadly speaking, there are two kind of ends of the spectrum when it comes to looking at this. One is the kind of very global and centralized business, and the other is the more nationally focused and more devolved business in the way that it spends its money. And what I mean by this is that a more devolved business is one where most spending decisions will be made at a local level. So when that's, for example, a construction company or a facilities company, they will tend to make a lot of decisions locally about how to spend most of the money that they spend through the business. If you're a more centralized and global business, then you have particular challenges and also opportunities around how you can take this forward. The opportunity is that as a big centralized organization, you will have considerable spending power. So you will have a good relationship with your suppliers and a lot of opportunity to leverage that in order to make them change the way that they do things. You will also typically have a smaller and more centralized procurement team, which means that the number of people that you have to influence is smaller than it would be in a more decentralized organization. The challenges that come with that are that in a more centralized organization, you will have much, much higher barriers to entry for the social enterprises themselves, because typically the contracts that you'll be working on will be much, much larger and will often be global or at least kind of regionally based in outlook. If we look at the diagram here for a centralized business, and in this case this is Johnson & Johnson and their social impact through procurement program, then what you can see there is that the focus that they have has been on some direct relationships. So there are some opportunities when even at great scale they can buy things directly from social enterprises. But a lot of their focus has been on how they drive this through their big tier one providers, so through the main businesses that supply into Johnson & Johnson, because that's where the in-country opportunities are and that's where they can really drive this forward with social enterprises. There's also a lot of focus around how they work with their centralized procurement team, so how we've done training and support to help them to understand what to do and how we've communicated that across the business. Because within a large centralized business, that ability to influence budget holders is equally important as influencing the procurement team themselves. Moving to the other end of the spectrum then, to a more national business that has a much more devolved supply chain, so where much more decisions are made locally, you've got the opposite challenges to what you'd have in a large centralized business. So while spend might actually be quite similar in terms of overall numbers, you find that the profile of it will be much more tilted towards smaller providers, which is great in that means that there's much more chance of them working with social enterprises directly, but also that creates challenges because you're having to influence many, many more people outside of the small procurement community in the centralized business in order to direct the spend and to make them change their behaviors to create the same impact. So in the second example, with a much more devolved business, what we can see in the diagram is a very different approach to how this is done. So what we've done, and this is Waits, who are a construction company in the UK, and what we've done with them is to create a much more centralized process that helps all of their people across all of their construction sites, and they'll typically have kind of 250 or 300 sites live at any one time, to access the same centralized information. We've created a central portal for them to access social enterprises that they can do locally across all of those sites. And also we've helped them to build a network of social enterprise champions, because it's very difficult for us to influence those several hundred people locally. But by working through champions that are based regionally within the business across the UK, they can work locally in order to make sure that this is driven through the business. And by setting targets nationally, we can make sure that those are driven and implemented across all areas of the organisation. Of course, it's worth saying that these are kind of both examples from either end of the spectrum, and it may be that your business is located somewhere along here or has elements of both within how it operates. I think it's important to say that both the examples given here of Johnson & Johnson and Waits actually spend a very similar amount of money in terms of volume in the UK, but the approaches are very different. And it might be that within your business, you need to mix and match the two in order to get the maximum impact. So now you've made the case, you've identified the type of business and the approach that you need to take, and now you're ready to get started. So here's our tips on how to then take that forward within your business. The first thing to do is to understand, are there any social enterprises you're already working with? So within the Biosocial Corporate Challenge, we do this through a diagnostic process where we take a long vendor list of all of the suppliers that the business is working with, and we run that against our database of social enterprises. And what that gives us is a list of social enterprises that are already being bought from within the business, and in some cases have been for several years. And so far, across the 16 suppliers that we've got, we've always found that there are social enterprises already embedded in the supply chain, and that they're often ones that the business wasn't aware of. Having social enterprises already in the supply chain is a real benefit because it makes it feel less new and different. And sometimes we have challenges because there's a feeling that this is bringing something very different into supply chain, something very different. So if you can demonstrate that there are social enterprises already there and that you've already been working with for several years, that gives a lot more confidence to people across the procurement team that this isn't something quite so different, and actually this is more a continuation of work that they're already doing. The second step is then to look to identify new suppliers that you could work with. So again, as part of the diagnostic process, once we've understood what the business is already doing, the next thing that we'll then do is look to make recommendations on how they could do more. So that means looking at how we match the way in which that business buys and the categories that it does it through with what the social enterprise sector can deliver. And that might be around specific sectors or categories, or it might be around certain geographies. So looking at local sites or local areas where there are good opportunities for them to engage. And what we want to think about here is both a short, medium and long-term approach to this. So there are some quick wins that we want to look to get embedded early on and that will start to bring a bit of exposure and a bit of recognition of what's happening. But equally at the same time, some of those larger wins that will often take longer, it's important to identify those early because you need to start working through the process of how that will happen when the next opportunity might be 18 months or 2 years down the line. The third step that we do then is around training. So it's really important that this is something that is owned by the procurement function because the procurement function is the area that can really drive this across the business. So what we'll look to do is to go in and work to train all of the procurement teams within that business to understand what a social enterprise is, what the opportunity is around doing this, so why should they want to do this, and some of the drivers that we talked about earlier, and then to think about how they can do this, and really to try and draw that down to their individual category or area of responsibility so that they can personally hold and understand how they can do more and why they should want to do that. The fourth area is then about targets. And there's been different approaches to this across the businesses that we've worked with, but generally it's helpful for most businesses to set a target around how they're going to do that. So thinking about how do you make either an individual accountable around achieving a certain level of spend with social enterprise, or around making certain bits of the business accountable around how they do that, because that can then help you to both record and track improvement and growth over time so that you're meeting the objectives that you have, and you can demonstrate that to your business and to other stakeholders. The fifth and final thing then is to report back on the impact that you've achieved. So one of the things that we do through the Biosocial Corporate Challenge is to provide an aggregated impact report on all of the spend, and so far that's £45.3 million spent with social enterprises, both in terms of how that's been done and where from a business perspective, but also kind of what is the impact that that's had, both in terms of the social impact created by those social enterprises, so the people that they've employed, the profit that they've been able to reinvest, the impact that they've had on their communities and on people's lives, but also, and sometimes equally usefully internally, what has that meant for the procurement function, for the people that are involved, for the business winning, for the talent, for those other areas that we talked about earlier, because that can really help to drive internal engagement and help you to get more investment and more engagement in taking this forward even further. So you've got everybody engaged and the plans in place. And now here are some top tips from the last 6 years that we've been doing this on how to really drive this forward and get the most from your engagement with social enterprises. The first and most important thing to remember is to think about supply and demand. And this is often overlooked because often when you look at the social enterprise space, you see a huge number of suppliers who can deliver all sorts of things. But one of the things that we often say is that while social enterprises can deliver pretty much anything, they can't necessarily do it everywhere or at the right scale that you need for your business. So it's vitally important that you think about what you buy, how you buy it, and how that matches on to what the sector can deliver. Just as an example of this, when we started working with construction companies about 6 years ago, a lot of them were looking for suppliers that were in areas of construction trades. So they were looking for bricklayers or scaffolders or some of the things that provide services directly to construction businesses. And in the UK at least, the reality is that there are very few social enterprises that operate in these areas. And so much as they might look for trying to find them across all areas of the country, there was very little out there. Whereas by working with them and using the knowledge that we have of the sector, we could help them to think about supplier bases where there were a lot of opportunities nationally, so that we could reorientate where they were looking for opportunities to the areas where there was real strength in the social enterprise sector, rather than areas of real weakness. The second area that we would look at is around what we would call discrete spend. And this is particularly important for more globalized and centralized businesses where a lot of their opportunities are tied into very large global, potentially, frameworks, and where sometimes procurement teams tend to discount some of the smaller opportunities that they might have that might be more site-specific or tend to be done in a spot purchasing way, so things that they'll just buy individually on a one-off basis rather than continuously through the year. And this might include things like video production, things like events, things like away days, things like corporate gifts. All of these small things that in their own right seem like relatively minor purchases, but when added together can make a significant sum of money, which can have a significant impact on the social enterprises that you're working with. The other great thing about these opportunities is that they tend to be very visual. So there's the sorts of things that will often be engaging your clients and your people because they can see or be at that conference venue, get that gift, or see that video production company in action, and that makes a real difference to driving engagement because they see the quality of the social enterprises in front of them. The third thing is that there are those social enterprises that can deliver at scale. So it shouldn't just be discounted that it's all going to be small opportunities and small pieces of spend here and there. There are those that can deliver multi-million-dollar contracts globally or at a European level. And so looking to find and identify those and then to work with them can create really major impacts and examples that can really drive the program forward. The fourth thing that we'd say is to use your supply chain. And again, this is particularly important with those more centralized businesses where you have that real leverage over the suppliers that you work with. But where things are less easy in a direct way because of some of those barriers to entry that we talked about earlier, a really key way is to think about how you can collaborate with your supply chain. So good areas to do this are things like facilities management or catering or marketing spend, where you might be working with one or two big providers, but that they will then have long supply chains that will have what we call a long tail, which means they'll work with lots and lots of small providers lower down. And the way to sell this in, I think, is not to make it something where you're really trying to drive them to do it because you want them to do and being very bureaucratic about it, but much more to engage them about the opportunity and use some of that business case language that we talked about earlier to get them to see the opportunity in doing this, because this can not just help them with their business with you, but this can also help them to win business with other organisations interested in this, be they in the government sector or the private sector. The fifth thing I'd say is to be creative about how you do this. So often you may find that in a certain category, there's nothing immediately obvious that comes out. So there might not be any direct social enterprises that look like they might be able to work with you, and you might not be sure how to take it forward. But one thing that I've definitely found over the last few years is that the people that run social enterprises are real entrepreneurs. So seeing the opportunity to have a conversation with them about how you could collaborate to do something differently or how they could operate differently in order to meet your needs is always worth doing. Because by doing that, you both give them the opportunity to do something different and maybe pivot into a new area or operate in a different way, but also you'll be designing a solution that exactly meets your business requirements, so it's a real win-win. The sixth thing would be to work with suppliers that really engage your business. And here is where you can unlock some of the things that tie to some of the strategic drivers that you might have that we talked about earlier. Because this can really help to generate buy-in and engagement with senior leadership and get them to see this initiative as something that can have a real impact on the way that the business takes things forward and create a slightly different view of how the procurement function operates within that. And the final thing I'd say is the importance of communication in all of this. Making sure that you communicate effectively across the procurement function about how you're doing this and the sharing successes across that. How you communicate with wider budget holders in the business so that they can express a preference and look to bring social enterprises to you. How you can engage with wider internal stakeholders and particularly the leadership within the business about how this ties to strategic priorities and how this helps to bring things forward for you. And also engaging externally, so thinking about how you can engage your clients, your customers, or government around the opportunity of this area and how you're showing leadership through your delivery of it. So that brings us to the end of this unit. Thank you for listening.